The timeline belonged to something older than stars. They came to take it back. We had other plans. Sergeant Eden Calloway had been awake for 31 hours when the alert came through, and she was on her third cup of something that tasted like burned asphalt and ambition when the wall display lit up red. Not the soft orange of a boundary infraction, not the yellow pulse of a bureaucratic anomaly. Red. Full-spectrum emergency red, the kind that only fired when something had been taken from a place that couldn't have anything taken from it. She was already pulling on her jacket before the speaker finished its automated warning sequence. The Temporal Enforcement Division occupied the 42nd floor of a building that didn't officially exist in New Las Vegas. In the year 2297, in a city that had been rebuilt 3 times since the oceans crept up and swallowed what had come before. From the windows, if you looked west at the right angle and at the right time of night, you could still see the tips of the old stratosphere poking out of the reclamation waters like a finger, pointing at a heaven that no longer answered. Calloway never looked. She didn't have time for omens. Quinn was already in the briefing room when she got there. Of course he was. Charles Quinn had the kind of face that always looked slightly offended by the world. Permanently narrowed eyes and a jaw set hard, like he was waiting for someone to say something he could contradict. He'd been her partner for 8 months, and she still hadn't figured out whether she liked him. She'd stopped trying. "Tell me it's not what I think it is," she said. Quinn's expression answered before he did. Captain Marcus Shields stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man who has already run the numbers and doesn't like any of the answers. He was a large man, former enforcement, former military before that, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for a different, harder era. On the table in front of him was a holographic projection of an object that made Calloway's stomach drop through the floor and keep going. At 031 hours this morning, Shields said, an extraction event was recorded at the Envision City Secure Repository. Year 4225. The item taken is classified as an Omega-class temporal disruption device. What the old files used to call a crazy weapon. The air in the room changed. There are only 11 of those things in existence, Quinn said. His voice was flat, clipped, and 6 of them are locked in the forward vault at Envision. We're locked. 5 are locked, Shield said. Were. Calloway looked at the rotating hologram. The crazy weapon didn't look like much. A handheld device, smooth-sided, roughly the shape and weight of a large book. No visible controls, no obvious barrel or emitter. The kind of thing you'd pick up at a market stall and put back down because it didn't seem to do anything. Which was, she supposed, why it was the most dangerous artifact in recorded human history. It didn't do one thing, it did everything. It reached into the fabric of sequential time and rewrote the local conditions of causality. Not with explosion or force, but with precision, with silence, with something that felt, to the people on the receiving end, like the universe quietly deciding it had made a mistake about you. Who took it? Calloway said. It wasn't quite a question. Shields brought up a second image. A woman, tall, lean, with the kind of easy confidence in her posture that came either from complete competence or complete pathology. She had a narrow face and dark eyes that looked at the surveillance feed with the specific expression of someone who has noticed the camera and decided it doesn't concern them. Wanda Jones, Quinn said. Whispers. Calloway had heard the name. Everyone in enforcement had heard the name. Wanda Jones, called Whispers, because you never heard her coming, never heard the alarm she didn't trigger, never heard the lock she couldn't open. Was the most accomplished thief and escape artist in the 3 centuries of documented history that followed the Great Reorganization. She'd stolen things that were supposed to be unstealable. She'd walked out of containment facilities that weren't supposed to have exits. She'd done all of it without leaving fingerprints, without leaving witnesses, without leaving anything except the very specific and pointed absence of whatever she'd decided to take. She's already gone temporal, Shields said. Our tracking puts her extraction point at approximately 1970 Colorado. Colorado, Quinn said. 1974. That's pre-contact, Calloway said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Pre-contact. The era before humanity's first confirmed encounter with the Varrock. The alien civilization that had arrived in the solar system in 2031 with a kind of patient, architectural certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. The Varrock did not conquer in the traditional sense. They reorganized. They arrived, assessed, and began the slow process of reclassifying the inhabited planets of the inner solar system according to their own taxonomy, which placed humanity somewhere between a natural phenomenon and a persistent irritant. They had been renegotiating the terms of human survival for 266 years. It was an ongoing process. Humanity was stubborn about it. Pre-contact Colorado meant a time when none of that had happened yet. When humanity didn't know what was coming, didn't have the defensive infrastructure, the temporal shielding, the 300 years of hard-won, institutional knowledge of how to not be reorganized out of existence. Whatever Wanda Jones wanted to do with a crazy weapon in 1974, it wasn't going to be small. She's going to change something, Calloway said. Something about the contact event. Either delay it, accelerate it, alter the terms. Or prevent it entirely, Quinn said. Shields looked at them both. That's the optimistic interpretation. The pessimistic one is that she's going to use the device to give the Varric an advantage they didn't historically have. She grew up in the orbital territories. Her family came through the reorganization. She may have grievances. Grievances, Quinn said. He said it like the word had an unpleasant taste. She may have grievances, Shields repeated. Slower, heavier. Whatever her motivation, she cannot be allowed to activate that weapon. The downstream effects on the established timeline, even a minor causal rewrite in 1974, creates casque failures we cannot predict or correct. At that level of the temporal stack, there are no small changes. Calloway was already running through the extraction math in her head. Temporal transit to 1974. They'd come out within a 30-kilometer radius of her last tracked position, which the system put somewhere in the high country west of Denver. They'd have roughly a 6-hour window before the crazy weapons activation cycle completed. She'd been in worse spots. She tried to think of a specific example and came up slightly short. You mentioned a third operator, she said to Shields. The alert referenced a third asset. Shields didn't quite sigh, but something shifted in his posture that suggested the next part of the briefing was his least favorite. Spencer Cooper, timeline regulator, 3rd class. He's being assigned to your unit for the duration of this operation. Quinn's face did something complicated. A timeline regulator was not enforcement. A timeline regulator was something closer to an auditor. Someone trained in the theoretical architecture of causal chains, the mathematics of how small changes propagated forward through time, in the documentation and assessment of temporal incursions. They were useful in the way that a very detailed map was useful. Critically important and not helpful in a fistfight. Spencer Cooper arrived 4 minutes later, slightly out of breath, carrying a bag that looked like it had been packed in the dark by someone who wasn't sure how long they'd be gone. He was younger than Calloway had expected, with an open face, and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had just received news that was significantly larger than they'd been prepared for. He had the look of a person who worked in a room with a lot of monitors and didn't spend much time in the field. His jacket had a pen leak near the pocket. He looked at Calloway. He looked at Quinn. He looked at the holographic display of the crazy weapon. Right, he said. Okay, right. You've done transit before, Calloway said. It was half question, half attempt to establish a baseline. Training runs, simulation adjacent, a couple of assessment jumps, nothing active. He paused, nothing with a live incursion target. Quinn made a sound that wasn't quite audible. You'll be fine, Calloway said. She wasn't sure if she meant it, but she said it with the specific authority of someone who had learned that confidence was a resource you rationed carefully and gave away strategically. Stay close. Don't touch anything you don't recognize. If I tell you to get behind something, get behind it immediately and stay there. What if I have a theoretical observation that might be relevant to the save it for after? They went through transit at 0412 hours, and the world came apart at the seams and put itself back together wrong. And then they were standing in a meadow in Colorado in the autumn of 1974, and the air smelled like pine and altitude, and something that Calloway's lungs took a moment to process as clean. Genuinely, historically clean, before 2 more centuries of atmospheric processing and chemical layering. The sky overhead was a color blue that had no exact name in modern usage. The mountains to the west were impossible in the way that beautiful things sometimes were. Too large, too present, too insistent about their own existence. Quinn checked his tracker immediately, already moving, already scanning the tree line. Spencer Cooper stood still for 3 full seconds and looked at the mountains. Cooper, Calloway said. Sorry. He blinked, pulled out his own equipment. I've read about this. The pre-industrial light spectrum, the visual data doesn't capture it. It's different when you're... Where is she? Quinn said. Cooper pulled up his reader. 22 kilometers southwest. She's not moving. She's either in position or she's setting up. Setting up, Calloway said. She needs time to prime the device. The crazy weapon doesn't just fire, it has a preparation sequence. She'll need a stable location, a clear causal anchor point, something significant. She was already thinking through the historical geography of this region in this era. What's 22 kilometers southwest? There's a small town, Cooper said. Population about 800. It has weight. He was reading something on his scanner that was making his expression shift through several stages. There's a Varric survey node. Dormant. Pre-contact hibernation state. It's been there since. He looked up. Since approximately 30,000 years before this moment. The silence that followed had weight to it. They surveyed the system before contact, Quinn said slowly. They surveyed every habitable system, Cooper said. Standard Varric pre-colonization procedure. They seed passive observer nodes. Let them run for geological timescales. Harvest the data when they arrive. It's in the historical record. We found them after contact and the Varric confirmed it. There are 17 of those nodes on Earth. This one is inactive, dormant, just collecting. He paused. But if someone were to activate it early, if someone used a crazy weapon to rewrite the local causal conditions around that node and turn it on, 250 years before the Varric arrive, they'd know everything, Calloway said quietly. Not just passive survey data, active intelligence, population centers, infrastructure, defensive posture, 2.5 centuries of live observation. She felt something cold move through her chest. They'd arrive knowing exactly what we were before we knew they existed. The reorganization would have been different, Cooper said. His voice had gone flat and careful. The terms humanity negotiated, the ones that kept us present and sovereign in our own system, even partially, those were negotiated from a position of partial information parity. We knew enough to matter. We knew enough to make ourselves inconvenient to remove. But if they'd had that much lead time, we'd have been organized away before we could back, Quinn said. They stood for a moment, in the clean autumn air of 1974, with the weight of everything that had ever been decided about humanity's survival pressing down on the present moment. And then Calloway started moving. The terrain was rough going, high country, mixed forest, the kind of ground that demanded your attention and didn't apologize for it. She set a pace that was fast without being reckless, and Quinn matched it immediately, with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this before. And Spencer Cooper matched it too, without complaint, though she could hear his breathing work harder on the uphill sections. He didn't fall behind, she made a note of it. They were 2 kilometers out when Cooper's scanner registered the activation pulse, a low, rhythmic electromagnetic signature that had no natural source. She's started the prime sequence, Cooper said. We've got approximately 40 minutes before the weapon reaches full charge. Is 40 minutes enough to stop her? Quinn said. It's what we have, Calloway said. The Varric survey node was housed inside a natural rock formation at the edge of a tree line, indistinguishable from the surrounding geology unless you knew what the geometry meant, and even then it took a second look. Wanda Jones had set up in the clearing in front of it, and she'd done it professionally. Cover positions, an approach corridor that channeled any interceptor through open ground, and enough familiarity with the terrain to suggest she'd scouted it before she activated the device. The crazy weapon was mounted on a field support frame in the center of the clearing. It was not the size Calloway had expected. The holographic projection hadn't quite conveyed the scale. In person, activated, cycling up to operational charge, it was larger and stranger, and the air around it had a quality she didn't have a good word for. Like, the space immediately adjacent to the device was paying slightly more attention to events than space normally did. Wanda Jones stood 10 meters from the device with her hands in her pockets, and she looked at the 3 of them emerge from the tree line with an expression of measured evaluation rather than surprise. She'd expected pursuit. She'd planned for it. Sergeant Calloway, she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it. You made good time. Step away from the device, Calloway said. In a moment, she didn't move. I want to explain something to you first. You don't need to explain. My grandmother, Wanda Jones said, was 9 years old during the 4th reorganization. When the Varric reclassified the Western orbital habitats, she remembered watching the displacement happen. Watching her family's home of 6 generations get redefined as a managed territory. She spent the rest of her life waiting for humanity to do something about it, and humanity spent the rest of her life negotiating and adjusting and finding terms and making accommodations. She looked at Calloway steadily. We have been negotiating our own dignity for 260 years. I'm done negotiating. What you're doing doesn't remove the Varrock, Cooper said. He took a step forward, which Calloway hadn't expected, and his voice was careful and precise, and carried the specific weight of someone who has run the numbers and is not guessing. I understand what you want. I understand why. But if you activate that device and turn on that node, you don't prevent the contact. You don't change their decision to come here. You change their information advantage at arrival. You make it worse. Everything your grandmother survived, everything that came after. The parts that weren't good, the parts that were devastating, those are the negotiated remnants of a humanity that was still present enough to negotiate. A humanity with 250 years of live intelligence working against it doesn't get those terms. A humanity with 250 years of live intelligence working against it doesn't get the conversation. Wanda Jones looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite doubt but was adjacent to it. You're the regulator, she said. Spencer Cooper, 3rd class. He said it without embarrassment. I know it doesn't sound like much. The crazy weapon cycled louder. The air around it was developing a shimmer that wasn't heat and wasn't light. It was something older than both, the specific quality of time becoming aware of itself. 30 minutes, Quinn said quietly, from behind Calloway's left shoulder. Wanda Jones looked at the device, and Calloway watched her face, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see in it. Not certainty, but calculation. Wanda Jones was not a true believer. She was an engineer of outcomes, and engineers of outcomes could be reasoned with if you gave them better numbers. Tell me what happens, Wanda said. If I pull this, historically, walk me through it. Cooper did. He walked her through it in clear, unsparing terms, not as a threat, not as persuasion theater, but as an honest accounting of the causal mathematics. He cited the specific leverage points that humanity's relative information parity had created at the original contact event, the negotiations that had preserved orbital sovereignty, the population retention agreements, the 12 territorial concessions that were devastating, and the 31 that humanity had refused, and refused successfully. Because the Varrock's own historical intelligence about the system was incomplete, and they'd had to account for what they didn't know. He talked for 11 minutes without stopping, and he cited sources and cross-referenced dates, and corrected himself once on a minor figure and kept going. Wanda Jones listened. She was very still. The information gap, she said finally. That's the only weapon we've ever had. Yes, Cooper said, and activating the node closes it. Retroactively. Completely. She stood there for a long moment with the crazy weapon cycling behind her, and the October light coming through the Colorado pines in long slanted columns, and the mountains enormous and indifferent in the middle distance. Calloway's hand was resting near her sidearm, and she was not drawing it, and she was not going to draw it unless the device hit full charge. And she was watching Wanda Jones's face, and she was waiting. She had learned, in 8 years of enforcement work, that the most important moments almost never looked like the most important moments. They looked like a person standing in a field, thinking. They looked like the pause before a decision that would go all the way through history. Can you disarm it? Wanda Jones asked. Yes, Cooper said. Show me, she said. Show me you can actually do it, and I'll step back. Cooper walked forward. He walked straight across the open ground, without hesitation, and Calloway watched Quinn tense beside her, and she put one hand briefly on his arm. Hold, wait, let this happen. And Cooper reached the device and pulled out his toolkit and began the disarmament sequence with the focused someone who has studied this problem for a very long time in rooms with a lot of monitors and was now, for the first time, solving it in the actual world. It took 9 minutes. The cycling pitch of the crazy weapon descended gradually, like a held breath let out over stages, and the shimmer in the air around it faded, and then it was quiet. Wanda Jones stood with her arms crossed and watched Cooper work, and she didn't run and she didn't resist. When it was done, she looked at Calloway. I still want the same thing, she said. I know, Calloway said. The reorganization still happened. My grandmother still, I know. She meant it. She could hear, under the legal architecture of what came next, the arrest, the containment, the long process of accountability, something that deserved to be heard, even if it couldn't be the excuse for what Jones had tried to do. I know. Quinn cuffed her with professional precision and no particular relish. On the walk back through the trees, with the sun dropping toward the peaks and the air going cold and thin around them, Spencer Cooper fell into step beside Calloway. He was carrying the disarmed crazy weapon in a containment case, And he looked somewhat shaken and somewhat elated in the way that people sometimes looked after they'd done the thing they were most afraid of. You did well, Calloway said. He considered this. I cited 3 secondary sources instead of primary ones. The population retention statistics I gave were approximate. The precise figure is 4.7 million, not approximately 5. And I mispronounced Varick concordance at one point. She stood down. She did. They walked in silence for a moment. The mountains were doing the thing they did in this era, in this light, at this altitude, insisting on their own magnificence without apology or restraint. Do you think she was right? Cooper asked. Not about the method. About the underlying thing. Calloway thought about the stratosphere tower sticking up out of the reclamation waters. About the orbital reorganization that her own grandparents had survived in a technically complete but historically complicated sense. About 260 years of negotiation and concession, and the specific human talent for continuing to be inconvenient to people who would prefer you not exist. I think, she said carefully, that we've been told our whole lives that the information gap is a disadvantage, that not knowing what the Varick know makes us weaker. She paused. But everything Spencer just said in that clearing, it means that what they don't know about us is the only reason we're still having conversations instead of just being a categorized footnote. And what they don't know about us. She stopped. Let it sit for a second. What they never seem to be able to account for is that we do this. This, Cooper said. We send someone like you into a clearing to talk down a person with the most dangerous weapon in human history. And it works. Because we've got someone who spent 6 years learning the numbers well enough to care about the difference between 4.7 million and approximately 5. Quinn, 3 steps ahead of them, said nothing. But something in his shoulders had shifted to a position that was not quite agreement, and was also not quite disagreement, which, from Quinn, was practically an endorsement. The transit back opened in the meadow at dusk, and the portal chewed a hole in the October air with its specific unnatural light. And for a moment, all of 1974 was lit in blue-white, and the trees cast shadows in the wrong direction. And the mountains were briefly made strange. Wanda Jones looked back at them as they prepared to step through. Not at Calloway, at Cooper. If you'd been wrong about the numbers, she said. I wasn't, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once. Not agreement, exactly, but something like acknowledgement, and they went through. In the debrief, 3 hours later, with the crazy weapon, in a secure vault and the extraction reports filed and the causal integrity scan coming back clean across the affected temporal region, Captain Shields sat at the head of the table and looked at his 3 officers with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as his face generally permitted. The node was not activated, he said. The timeline is intact, the device is secured. He paused. Good work, Quinn, who had said almost nothing on the trip back, said. Cooper's saved operation. Everyone looked at him, including Cooper. He talked her down, Quinn said, in the tone of someone presenting a factual record. We were in position. But if we'd gone in hard, she'd have triggered the device as a dead man. He assessed that and moved before we had time to argue about it. He looked at Shields. I'd recommend an operational commendation and a grade review. His current classification is 3rd class. Shields looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at his hands. I cited the wrong figures in 2 places, he said. Did it work? Shields said. A pause. Yes. Then we'll discuss the figures later. Calloway sat back in her chair and felt something she didn't quite have a name for. Not pride exactly, because it hadn't been her win. Not relief exactly, because the operational threat had been abstract enough that the body hadn't quite caught up to the stakes. Something adjacent to both of those. The specific feeling, she thought, of having watched a situation find the person it needed. She thought about Wanda Jones in a holding cell, 2 floors down, and the grandmother she'd mentioned, and the Western orbital displacement, and the 31 times humanity had refused terms it couldn't afford to accept and refused them anyway. She thought about the Varick survey node sitting dormant for 30,000 years in a Colorado rock formation, waiting patiently to be activated, gathering its quiet and incomplete picture of what humanity was. Incomplete. That was the thing. They'd had 30 millennia of passive observation, and they'd still gotten enough wrong to need 260 years of negotiation instead of a clean acquisition, because humans kept doing things that the survey data didn't predict. Kept producing the people that the taxonomy didn't account for. The wardens and Coopers. The exhausted sergeants who knew when to hold their hand back from the sidearm. The thieves who loved their grandmothers enough to try to change history, and listened when the numbers didn't cooperate. You couldn't survey for that. You couldn't put it in a node and let it collect for geological time. It just kept happening, stubbornly, unpredictably, in clearings and briefing rooms and on hard uphill terrain with altitude working against it. And it kept being, against all reasonable expectation, enough. Outside, the new Las Vegas skyline burned orange and neon in the dark, and the reclamation waters to the west were still and reflecting, and somewhere under there the old tower was still pointing up at the same sky it always had. Calloway went home, set an alarm, slept 6 hours, showed up in the morning because someone had to, and it had always turned out to be someone.